So this is my 4.0.6, at least based off of the PTR notes, which are probably going to get changed. I see a couple of issues with them. So I'll start with what I know best, and this is Warriors. A lot of people complained about the Warrior nerfs, or the Warrior burst, I suppose, which came directly from Insight, Recklessness, Deadly Calm, Throwdown, Lambs of the Slaughter stacking, and double overpowers. It is a lot of setup. It is rather annoying to do, but it did outright kill people, no matter what. I think the only class that actually lived through it was our DK main tank for my guild. I did take down the warrior from our guild, who popped his wall right after I won the duel, trying to get out of the stun, because he wasn't using a PvP trinket and he's a dwarf. So that's kind of how bad it is, which I agree it needs to get nerfed. However, doing so on a 5-minute cooldown, I mean, I don't think it needs this bad of a nerf, even though it's not as bad of a nerf as it seems. So, the first thing they changed is Juggernaut. So, Juggernaut's going to make charge usable in combat. It's not going to increase the cooldown of charge anymore. It's just going to make it share cooldown with Intercept, which is rather annoying because we can't double stun. So it's going to be a 15-14 because glyphs pretty much going to be required if they're sharing cooldowns. Glyph's going to take off a second. I hope they don't forget about the 4-piece and that they make it so they're 9 seconds, which would be great. Things I see the problem with, you're still entirely susceptible to roots, and that most warriors are probably going to go Fury now. The movement was one of the key reasons I stayed arms as opposed to Fury or playing Prot. Prot's damage is still fairly high. They tried to nerf it and it didn't do too well. So what hopefully they do to charge is they remember a 4-piece. They turn it into a 9-second cooldown if you glyph it, 10 if you don't. 15 in rage probably, seems about right. And then my hopes is Warbringer gets you out of roots and snares with Intervene. Heroic Fury gets you out of snares and roots and refreshes your Intercept. I'm hoping Charge will work like Warbringer and get you out of snares and roots as well. It honestly seems like a little bit of a balance because this is a fairly hard nerf, cutting our movement in half. Granted, they're increasing the cooldown and trying to spread it out, but it is going to DR so quickly in 1v1s that it's stupid. Throwdown is not even going to exist in duels anymore because of DRing with charge. And then after 2 charges, you run into the same problem of everyone's going to jump your charge. So I hope they change it somehow. Getting out of roots would work great for jumping charges because you can just run that last distance. Granted, during the charge you can still get changed or roots at the end of it, but it would help. Maybe a 1-second immunity to it or something while you're charging might help. But whatever, it needs its balancing, and this is very early PTR notes, so hopefully it's better. Heroic Strike's getting a huge nerf. It's losing, I think it's going to scale down to about 20% of its damage from its AP scaling, which is going to get worse with gear. So the higher your gear gets, the more likely you're going to want to slam. I've seen people try to slam in PvP with a spec, and it's not worth it at all. Cutting your rage gen, unless you're taking massive damage and want to blow your Berserker Rage for it, is not generally a good idea. So you're leaving PvP arms warriors with less damage overall than PvE, just because of the slam. They might make slam not pause your swing timer, be like the only cast in the game that doesn't do this. Be great. Or they could potentially change it to scale with haste, which would help PvE arms, which is severely hurting. It's approximately 180% behind Death Knights. DKs do, on the best fights, DKs can do 28k, armed warriors do like 18 to 19 on World of Logs. On the more unlucky fights, DKs are doing 18k, armed warriors are doing 9. More movement is pretty much what's hurting that. The Lambs of the Slaughter is a stacking buff, which is rather annoying. I'm not sure. I really hope it's consistent, that it's not eating 10% stacks on everything, that it's after 3 Mortal Strikes you do 30% more damage with Overpower and Mortal Strike. Hopefully that'll help PvE and give us roughly 30% more damage, and I'm assuming, my assumption is that no class is meant to be doing 28k DPS on a single target fight right now. They're all meant to be about 22 on that fight, and warriors are down at about 15, DKs are up at about 28. Same with a couple other classes that are really, really high. Survival Hunters being one of them. But that's just the PvE aspect of it. War Academy is getting switched into Mortal Strike, which is a little bit of a buff, but in the meanwhile, it is a nerf to Insight, and so is the overhead on Eric Strike, which does end up nerfing the gag order spec I like to play. So you're going to lose some of your damage, whereas, I mean, I suppose you don't really lose much of your damage compared to the other one, but 5% after a kick might actually end up being better towards more PvP, just because Heroic Strike really is probably aimed to be about a 10k crit instead of a 20. It'll probably be about 12 after all these nerfs, but that's basically what I look at. So Feral Druids did and didn't really get their nerf. Blizzard always takes a very roundabout way of doing things the way they need to. As a rough guess, I'd say their bleeds lost about 30% damage and got switched into physical, but that doesn't actually solve the main problem of bear tanks and Feral Druids in general. The problem that I run into is bear form in itself is a defensive cooldown. Just that a DPS Feral Druid can switch to bear form and take no damage and not be a viable switch target, and the bleeds go through regardless of it is the main problem. Druids being able to entirely tank you pretty much without actually needing to use a cooldown. I mean, maybe Barkskin if they're low, but even then bear form does do quite a bit of damage reduction on its own. That takes care of it. The problem was that they needed to make it, I mean, the bleeds could have scaled off of their current agility as opposed to when they were applied, so that they can't bear form or they lose lots of DPS when they do, and that actually probably would have solved the solution better than nerfing their bleeds and buffing their physical, and nerfing bear form DPS a bit, because they could get 15, 20k mangles in bear form if their vengeance stacked up. The answer to their main problem is to force them to stay in kitty instead of, blowing survival instincts and barkskin in kitty form as opposed to going to bear and then survival and then barkskin whenever they need them, because they do have a lot of defensive cooldowns that they can use, considering one of them doesn't even have a cooldown. I would pretty much put the bear form on top, pretty much equal with, shield block being up on an arms warrior with a shield out, where their damage is still rolling over fairly hard, and a warrior's damage pretty much becomes non-existent besides a few mortal strikes, which are going to hit for about a third, and then the longer kick, which, I don't know, it just seems a little bit unbalanced, and that's how I would have changed it, is had it scale off of like your current stats as opposed to their cast form when they're applied, but I suppose that's rather hard to do because it has to check multiple targets. So for Death Knights, I think you guys are all missing the point of the burst damage. Warriors can global someone on will with a 5-minute and a 2-minute and a 2-minute. Death Knights need a 1 minute and a couple of procs. They can do this every minute instead of once every 5. That with Necrotic Strike being retardedly overpowered because it's not scaling, they didn't fix this problem either. Necrotic Strike is going to be scaled off Brazil, but you can still 9 Death Ruin it. And that's where the problem happens. If you get your Gargoyle up and your Enraged Pet, them alone, with you spamming Necrotic Strike, will not live. In 4.5 seconds, because Death Knights have half globals, you can full Death Ruin yourself, and that's when you'd put up your Gargoyle. Or have your Gargoyle up before then, full Death Ruin yourself. And then you're going to want to dump all 4 Necrotic Strikes in, silence, Empower Ruin Weapon, Necrotic Strike, Blood Tap, Necrotic Strike, all of that, and you can get 9 off. And on my Death Knight, in tank item level 300 gear, which is terrible gear, it's 80k healing I stop. I'm assuming in PvP gear, this is more like 120. And yeah, that's a little bit too high. Necrotic Strike needs to have diminishing returns on its stacking. So if it absorbs 100, or not 100k healing. If it absorbs 10, it should go 10, 5, 2. So if you 3 stack it, it's 17k instead of 30. That's how I think they should change it. But I don't know. It might be hard to do. Dark Simulacrum is currently bugged. You can't macro it. Whatever. I like focus macros. I can't do it. It's rather annoying. But I mean, my way of getting around this is put it on the bar twice, and then change the actual bar, one separate button sitting off on its own, set to a focus target, is how I fixed it, and I just have 2 different keybinds for it. But that's a very annoying way to do it because I have to use an add-on. I think they hotfixed the enraged pet at the start, so you're not going to see Unholy Death Knight in 2s because they do require a ton of setup. They have to get off 5 death coils, and then they still have to get 60 ruin power to get their pet out, which is about 20 seconds of setup, if that's entirely what you're trying to go after. So that hopefully Unholy DK DPS isn't going to be seen very much. Unholy DK Frost Mage might be seen just because of the CC. They're still roughly 10k DPS above me in DPS spec, and so they just generally hit a hell of a lot harder than me. Their mastery, I'm hoping gets changed. It's straight disease damage, which is stupid. It's fun if you like to, kite someone to death. If you want to play your Death Knight like an Affliction Hunter, like I used to. But it's not the way the class is meant to be played. I hope they change the mastery to be more like Fury Warriors, where, Scourge Strike, Blood Strike, all of these things that scale off of damage would be increased by mastery instead of just the damage. So if you have a Scourge Strike with 3 diseases, it does 150% weapon damage plus 36 currently for 3 diseases as Shadow. That Shadow portion that requires diseases, as well as like the Blood Strike that goes up by 10% per disease, would be increased by your mastery. I hope that's how they change it, and I think that'd be a little bit better than disease, and then they would have more freedom to nerf Death Knights where it's needed, because it's very difficult to nerf a DK right now because of the way their runes work, and because of the way their rune power works and the rune generation. They're really a finicky class to try to change the balance on. Oh, the other thing I suspect happening on DKs is to force them to 2-handers like Blizzard posted on and get rid of Shadow Frost, which came back, which is kind of funny. They killed it. They kicked its ass in early Wrath, and it's back. It's going to be 2-handed scaling, 15% strength, basically probably into about 30% 2-handed damage, and possibly Death Coil. Scaling off of weapon damage would pretty much kick Dual Wield's ass. Mages and heroism in Arena. Ugh. Okay, mages first. Ring of Frost is you're going to get a 3-second immunity if you get dispelled from it. It still DRs with Poly, and I don't think this fixed my problem. My problem with it is that it's a freeze, and you can take damage in it, and it should be on the freeze DR. Which is difficult to do because the Shattered Barrier is on like a talent freeze DR. The pet DR is on pretty much a pet DR. Frost Nova is on its own DR, and then Cone of Cold's on... It might be on Frost Nova, I'm not entirely sure. But Ring of Frost, I think, should be on those Freeze DR. And I don't think Freeze DR should make you immune. If all mages DR were sharing DR, a mage would get like 1 or 2 shatter combos off, and then they'd have to sheep you for 20 seconds if they didn't kill you. I think it should just DR down to about 2 seconds, and then basically force you to do 1 Frostbolt and an Ice Lance, and then possibly a Deep Freeze, if it's not fully DR'd. Heroism's, it's being removed from Arena, mainly because they gave it to mages. Mages can Icy Veins, Cold Snap, Icy Veins. It's like 40 seconds of 20% increased speed, as well as then 45 seconds on hero. Makes them cast faster for the entire arena match. This is pretty much why it's getting removed, I think. Mages benefiting from heroism should be because they're playing with the Resto Shaman. And Shamans are already down at cooldown because of heroism. So removing it from Arena means Shamans are going to need something else. They got Spirit Walker's Grace, which, I mean, that's great for Elemental and Resto Shamans, but I currently